I would say find the thing that you're passionate about and then just really go as deep as you can with it. And then you'll have examples of how you can say, look, this is how I provided value. These are 7 people that came back to me in my DMs and said, I went and bought such and such product because you convinced me.
Welcome to For the Long Run, the podcast exploring the why behind what keeps runners running long, strong, and motivated. I'm your host, Jonathan Levitt. Through personal and professional connections in the running world, I have the privilege of getting to know some amazing athletes. I've always been fascinated by the psychological aspect of running, and this podcast is aimed at exploring this and much more. I hope you enjoy. Have you guys heard of Beam? I have been absolutely loving their products lately. Beam is a CBD company that's making waves in the running world by offering products that combine THC-free CBD with other high-quality ingredients. It was founded by 2 ex-professional athletes with the idea that everyone should have the chance to experience what better feels like. Whether you're sore or stressed, Beam is key for recovery and self-care. Try it for yourself with 15% off using the code FTLR from beamtlc.com. I recommend Beam Dream Powder or the Focus Capsules. Welcome back. I have Patrick Lemieux joining me on the podcast today. Patrick, thanks so much for taking some time to chat.
Jonathan, real pleasure. I can see you've got a Boulder buzz still kind of just going around you. I could see I know you moved recently, and I can tell that you're in a real happy space right now. So I'm thrilled to be chatting with you.
Thank you. Noah Droddy said, "Don't ever let this get old," and my goal is to never let this get old. I ran hill repeats along Sanitas this morning, and about 75% into the longest rep, I didn't want to keep going, and I just looked around, and I was like, "Oh my God, this is fucking awesome!" And I get to do this here. Keep going. Yeah. Well, cool. So before we get too far into a chat about Boulder and Portland and all these amazing places to run, who is Patrick?
Sure. I guess in most cases, I'm either Gwen's husband or Stanley's dad. And, I think the last, we'll call it almost 10 years now, it's no secret. My wife has got a pretty decorated career, and I've been by her side for most of her career. We've also got a 3.5-year-old son who's taken on a life and passions of his own that's been super fun to sit through. And in the middle of that, I accidentally stumbled into this career of athlete management. So we've got a fair bit going on underneath our roof, and that's what I'm up to. But I think, here today, we're here to just give an inside look into what it looks like I call it athlete representation and the current climate of sponsorship in a year of COVID, and what I think it'll look like coming out of that.
Yeah, let's start there. A handful of people had questions about sort of your role with Gwen and your own athletes and whatnot. But let's start with social media, COVID, 2021, the Olympics. What has been the biggest challenge for you in that athlete management role in 2020 and 2021?
So I think in a traditional years of what athletes are doing and how somebody could relay what's going on to a sponsor, current sponsor, potential sponsor, it's always been around, here's athlete A, here's athlete A's realistic schedule of what they will do for races and what they would like to achieve. Would brand such and such like to be a part of that? In a year of COVID where there were no races for the most part, that completely changed, and it went and pivoted to, how are athletes telling stories? How are athletes capturing emotion? And what are they doing to demonstrate ROI for those sponsors in a year where there were no races? I'm very, very fortunate that I've got a small group of athletes. Some of them are fantastic on platforms like YouTube, and they were able to capture a ton of eyeballs and a ton of emotion and be very engaging and, bring a lot of attention to what they were doing, even more so than what a race would bring. So, yeah, that's what happened in a year of COVID. And I think what will happen is brands are shifting rethinking of how they're going to structure deals and what they need to do to capture eyeballs. And there will always be an importance on racing, but I think there will also be a greater importance on storytelling. And that's also going to be very, very important moving forward.
So I love that. I want to dive further into that. I find that aspect to be fascinating. The intersection of performance expectations versus storytelling expectations. But let's
Yeah,
back up a little bit and set the stage for
sure.
you as in this role. You said you sort of stumbled into it. Um, what does that mean?
Yeah, sure. So I think, I was a professional cyclist. I met Gwen. I was racing full time in 2011 and 2012 on a very small scale in the US. I was racing my bicycle. Um, I remember being at a team camp in 2012 and the team trying to demonstrate how important Twitter was. And I had a Twitter account and I used Twitter, but I didn't really understand the ability to convert sales on it or what that looked like. Fast forward to where we are today, that's a big part of it. In the meantime, my relationship with Gwen, I met her. I was along on the roller coaster where she won 2 world championships, won an Olympic gold medal. I say that was my period where I got my bachelor's degree in sports marketing, sitting next to her. And I've never been Gwen's agent, and I don't see a world where I ever will be her agent, but I sat next to her for that period. So now I talk about this is the period where I'm getting my master's degree in sports marketing, and one day I hope to have my PhD. So if we do this podcast again in 20 years, I hope I'm a grizzled veteran and I can say I'll be able to say I've earned my PhD in athlete management.
Nice. I got my bachelor's degree in sport management and marketing, and I've felt the last 8 years has been the master's and PhD program all bundled into one. So I feel you on that.
Yeah. So, and the reason why I stumbled into it is because I had a young woman named Ellen Noble who reached out to me in, I want to say October of 2018 and said, hey, was this something that would you help me out? And I just said, well, gosh,
And she's a cyclist, right?
she's a cyclist. Yeah. Yeah. Real prominent cyclocross athlete. And she really does all disciplines related to two wheels. So road, mountain, cross, even some of the niche stuff like enduro. She's represented there. And also she's your neighbor. She lives in Boulder.
Yep.
So you'll see her out and about, but she reached out to me and said, would you be my agent? And I just thought, well, geez, I don't know. I've never done this before for anyone. But I believe I could help you out. I think I know a lot about it, and I can see the umbrella of sponsors that you have, and I've lived with this endurance female, and I understand the needs and how to perform, and so that was the start of it, and it's continued to snowball, and now we're here. It's April of 2021, and this is a real deal job for me now.
It's so cool to see the growth of like I came into something because I saw a need and I learned along the way, and it just got bigger and better from there. I think that
Yeah.
education can open the right doors, and networking can open the right doors, but it's this you know fail, learn, fail, learn, and I think that's what leads to some substantial growth and allows people to be in the position they're in today.
Yeah, and the other biggest component to that is I'm blessed that I'm doing a job that I love. So I wake up every morning, hopefully it's at 6:30 in the morning, and I just like get out of bed and I'm like, this is great. I love my job. I love, I constantly call it I'm solving a puzzle. Um, I love all the puzzle pieces on the table and trying to make them fit every single day. It's something that I really, really enjoy. The job is I don't high stakes isn't the right word, but it is. I mean, it's high pressure. You're dealing with people's careers, athletes' careers, and you want to do the best work for them possible. But it's something that I'm very, very motivated to do every single day.
That's awesome. So getting back to the conversation we were having before, the intersection of performance versus storytelling. So
Yep.
I'd say when you started in 2012, or when you were racing in 2012, performance was probably 90%
Yeah.
of what mattered, or 95% of what mattered. Um, it's definitely, in my opinion, shifted towards storytelling. You look at athletes like all of the athletes on Northern Arizona Elite, or anyone who follows that model of come along for the ride and see my ups and downs. I think that that's the way to go. But how has it shifted for you from your position where you have athletes who are being paid to compete by their main sponsor and podium and
Sure.
whatnot? What's the balance that you communicate to them around performance versus like using Instagram?
So I'll tell you, no matter what, winning is still the number one and the most valuable currency. Coming closer to that and challenging that every single day is storytelling, right? So if you're an athlete that's winning and you're a storyteller, that's
Gold.
that's stardust. That's like you're just like that's just magic, right?
Yep.
Like that's a once in a generation athlete that somebody like myself could work with. The other piece now, why is storytelling such a big part of it? It's relatable, right? Like I'm competitive by nature, but the races that I get to win, I haven't won a race and it might be approaching 5 years now. It's I was second place a couple years ago at a race, but my ability to win is very little. Who do I identify with now? People like myself, people that are on the same journey. And remember, winning is exclusive, but your audience is looking for something that's inclusive. So if you're a fantastic storyteller, you get closer and closer to the power of winning. So, tools like Instagram and YouTube to convey that are fantastic. I encourage all athletes, not just my own, to be vulnerable and to demonstrate something that they can attach themselves to with fans. Does that answer your question?
It does, yeah. So I have a handful of friends who have professional athletes who are making a concerted effort to um, be more out there on social media. Dana Giordano is a mid distance runner for the BAA high performance team, and she's made an effort in the last couple of years to do this. She's like, who cares if I run fast?
Yeah.
People care if I'm relatable.
Yep.
And she's like tripled her social following with an audience that cares about her and about
Yep.
her journey. And she's got a very interesting journey. You look at another athlete like Ali Kiefer, and I was talking with her a couple of years ago about this, and she's like, I don't think the majority of my audience cares about the splits I run.
No.
They they care about how the workout went, and they don't care about the numbers. They care about the
Yep.
quality. And
That's right.
I think that the athletes that are at a higher level who are performing to win, but who also understand that like their fans are not going to run, sub 60 400 splits.
Yep.
Why does it matter? So
That's right.
talk about what happens in that penultimate rep. What happens when your back's against the wall and you don't want to keep going? That's that relatable emotion that anyone can relate to if you're running a 2 hour marathon, 4 hour marathon, or 8 hour marathon.
That's right.
So the athletes that you work with, um, is that sort of an innate talent that they have, or is that something you coach them on? And the reason I ask this is there are a handful of people that listen to this podcast that
Yep.
probably fit into this audience of being a professional athlete looking to make an impact beyond just race performances. So a little teaching going on
Sure.
here as well.
Yeah, I think there's always athletes that need encouragement in different arenas, and that could be being more vulnerable on social media or giving something that's relatable or giving call it a look under the hood and say like, what are you actually doing? How do you prepare to get ready for these races? So I think they will always benefit from having an outside source like myself, somebody that they trust. And I'm saying, I'm curious to know what you're doing. I bet your audience would also be curious to know what you're doing. Is that something that you could give us a look into? So if I'm curious about what they've got going on, other people would have to be curious. So that's how I'm looking at it.
Cool. Um, let's talk about balance from a balance standpoint. Um, Maybe it's your experience of Stanley and Gwen and
Sure.
yourself and your own racing and training and whatnot. How do you find that balance of like what to share and like what's too much? I know like you said he's 3.5. Like,
Yep.
do you want his whole life on there? But
Yeah.
the other piece is for her audience as a mom getting back into training or as a dad training, like
Yep.
I feel like that's like the most relatable
Yeah. Of course.
aspect.
Yeah, I would say you're always you're constantly configuring and calibrating what people want to see and what story you want to tell and how you want to do that. Like it's no secret that I think 6 weeks ago now, Gwen had a terrible 10K, right? And she was like, do I have to quit? Like, what am I going to do? And I think it took her 4 or 5 days before she told that and shared how challenging that race actually was, you know? And there are still some real personal times and moments that you have to say, okay, like, am I ready to share this with my audience? Am I ready to tell that story?
That makes sense. So building on that note, we've seen a lot in the last few years about female contracts and motherhood and the implications that it has on contract status.
Sure.
I'm curious from your perspective. I think we both agree that that point in life is probably the most relatable for those with
Yep.
similar audiences. How do you see brands evolving, or have you seen brands evolving to be more open to that type of storytelling?
I mean, I just think it's brands are clearly looking for. I think about Gwen's career when when there were contracts coming to her purely for her performance, and I would say now she's got brands equally coming to her for her storytelling ability, and they don't care if she runs a 15:08 or a 14:59. Like, obviously Gwen wants to break that performance threshold of going sub 15, but the brand will support her the same no matter the performance goal. So I think uh, the reality around, if you're a female athlete and you have to have a baby, it's essentially you've got to take 18 months off of your sporting career. And no matter what, that's challenging as an athlete. Like, you don't get, if imagine if you've got to take 18 months off for any sort of injury. I mean, it's hard. But I think brands are now more than ever, they want to be a part of that journey. And I'm really excited. I'm really excited how brands want to be a part of this. They've really, really stepped up.
So how do you sort of navigate that or narrate that, or maybe steer it is a better word, when that's a consideration for one of your athletes and they have a brand that they're working with or want to work with?
Sure. Yeah, I think the key, no matter what, whether it's in this case of, a woman wanting to become a mother for the first or second, third time with a brand, it's all about, no matter what, it's all about transparency and goals and laying out expectations. I've got clients that may want to just stay at home and do nothing to just train solely for an event in 5 months. And they're just going to say, look, I'm hands off. I've got this goal. I want to win this massive race. Here's what I'm going to do. Can we all work together? And can you just let me do my thing? Because if I perform on this day, it will pay off greatly for both parties. And are you okay with that? So I just push transparency and communication no matter what I'm trying to do. And at the end of the day, if you're transparent, you'll get your goals to align.
That makes sense. Let's switch gears a little bit, bike pun intended, and talk about your own career in racing. Do you remember your first ride?
No, I mean, I would have been so little. I've always had a passion for bikes. I've always had a passion for, bike racing. Riding a bike was just always something I wanted to do. So the first time I rode a bike, no, I don't remember that, but I do, I know that a bicycle's always been such a important part of my life.
For sure. So my dad is 60. He's been riding bikes probably for 55 years, and I learned from him, super early on to love it as well.
Yep.
And last summer we built up a cyclocross bike and did some mountain biking and gravel riding and all that stuff together. And it's been fun to see trails on the two wheels versus the 2 feet. So to your journey as a cyclist, um, when you were racing competitively, what was getting you out the door and what was fueling that fire on a regular basis?
So I think the biggest thing for me was I was highly competitive and I wanted to win. So that was always my motivation to do more, to do better. I think I just realized there was a moment, when I was dating Gwen, when she was getting ready for her first Olympics in 2012, I realized the difference between myself as a high level domestic athlete versus Gwen, who was a high level world class athlete. And I had enough, call it like self reality check to be like, okay, I'm not going to be a world class athlete. I need to think about what life looks like when I'm done racing my bike. And then there was also a big component too, where, bike racing is just dangerous. I was confronted with a bunch of dangerous moments that I just wasn't sure I wanted to keep um, revisiting. And so that's, I'd say, a big part of how I made peace with being done. So it was a bunch of things coming together. It was like my relationship with Gwen was evolving, bike racing was dangerous, and I'm not as good as I wish I could have been.
Was that hard to rectify though?
No, I had enough support in my life that when I was telling people I was going to quit bike racing to support Gwen, I did not have one person that said, Pat, I think you need to rethink that idea. So I think there was enough people that were surrounding Gwen that realized the potential that she had. And mind you, this was really early on in her career before she had any, a bunch of massive results behind her. But I had nothing but support behind me, giving me tailwinds to support her.
That's awesome. There's nothing better than that, like feeling of support and feeling that the people in your little village are behind you no matter what.
For sure, for sure. No, I needed that at the time.
So you mentioned that you're a competitive person. How do you keep that competitive fire stoked, or do you?
With what I'm doing right now, I mean, my biggest goal, like, I don't care about making any money. It's about I want to be attached to people that win. So I had two teams win a couple Sundays ago. I had an individual and then a team that I represent, and like I was on cloud nine the rest of for like 48 hours. I was just like, this is amazing. This is exactly why I do this job. So I would say the biggest thing that I look for is I want to have a small fingerprint on an athlete or a team's success. That's the ultimate thing that I chase, and the way that we monetize that on the back end, like that's the secondary thing that I also really enjoy. But that's not getting the biggest deal for me. Isn't a rush. It's seeing an athlete win on a weekend. That's what I live for.
And so how did you sustain that motivation in 2020, right? Where winning is the rush and
Yeah,
competing is the rush and watching your athletes is the rush. There's no racing.
yeah,
And how did you satisfy yourself
yeah,
and keep your athletes
yeah.
hungry?
So I think we've got to remember that, like in March of 2020, we thought this was going to be 4 weeks, and then we thought it was going
Right.
to be 6 weeks, and then we thought it was going to be like we'll be back racing, and then it was kind of like it took a while for there to be a definitive to be like, oh, I realize now there will be very little racing and accept that, right? And like so we were kind of kicking the can down the road. And
Right.
so I think there was just a naivete to it all. If I look back and reflect on 2020, um, I think 2020 for me personally would have been even more challenging had you told me on March 15th, no racing this year, right? And then, like, I think about Gwen, like, she got to do some kind of like staged racing in the back part of the summer, and that helped you get through, and then a little bit more into the fall. So
Yeah.
when you didn't get to scratch the competitive itch, yeah, it was tough. I didn't like it, and it's kind of I'm really now not taking the racing that we're doing for granted, and even just in my own little like hobby of racing, right? Like it's been a long time. It's like when you see me back on the start line of like these little local races, I mean, I'm going to be pumped and not taking it for granted. And that's what I encourage my athletes to do when they've resumed racing. I'm like, just don't take this for granted because it did get stripped away from you for a year.
Yeah. I had Shalane on the podcast back in March, and I asked her, like, how are you managing this with your athletes with so much uncertainty? And she's like, we're doing one thing. We're going to stuff the silo and get fit. And whenever we have the opportunity to race,
Mm-hmm.
we'll be ready. And again, that was like Boston was still happening and
Yep.
marathons were still happening in the fall and all that
Yep.
stuff, allegedly. And they didn't,
Yep.
obviously.
Yep.
And then I just think you talk about, when races are back and when you're on that start line for the first time. I think back to my first race back from injury, and I hadn't raced in like a year and a half. And it was September 2018. I'm standing on the start line of a 5K in Rhode Island, and I'm just like grinning from ear to ear. I hadn't
Yep.
raced it since the prior spring. And I'm just like, I feel like an animal uncaged. Like
Yep.
I was like, release me and let me
Yep.
go. And I came in second in that 5K. And I was like, it was like one of the best performances I've ever had. And gratitude was the strongest emotion there around like, this is such a privilege that we get to race. And until you get it taken away from you
You don't
forcefully,
realize it.
you don't realize it. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you.
Thanks again to Beam for sponsoring this episode of the podcast. As the days start to warm up and get longer, a cool down routine in the evening becomes even more important. Did you know that you can get a subscription to Beam's Dream Powder? It's what I use most nights before bed to help with a refreshing night's sleep. When you subscribe, you'll get the Dream Blend with a bunch of perks like even better pricing, free shipping, a free mug, and a drink frother just for signing up. Dream helps me wind down at night, and it's made with compounds like melatonin and magnesium that support a better night's sleep. Make sure to use the code FTLR at checkout for an extra 15% off the already discounted 20% off monthly rate. And now back to our conversation. So, what are you looking forward to most about 2021?
You know, I've got a lot of feelings and thoughts around just what I think is going to happen with the Olympics. And, you know, Gwen and I are really blessed that we've been through 2 Olympic cycles and one of them went really well for her. So there's not as much, the stakes for this Olympics are much different than if she were still competing in triathlon or trying to win a gold medal. So my heart is out there for the athletes that are supposed to win medals this year, or medal contenders, and their Olympic experience, whether it happens or not, is going to be very, very different. Maybe it's because they go to the Olympics and there's no fans there. But regardless, this Olympic cycle has been very, very different. So that's part of it. And then part 2, I'm excited to go to some races. I'm excited to be back and to just see my athletes race. And that's something that I'm really, really passionate about and I want to revisit. So, and part 3, I'm excited to do some club and local level races again. So those are the 3 biggest things I want to do in 2021.
Cool. So you mentioned a little bit there about your sort of expectations for Summer Olympics. Can you elaborate on that? I know none of us have the answers, but from where you sit today, what do you anticipate it potentially looking like?
I'm going to go one above where I think it's going to happen. So my reality is I don't think the Olympics will happen. But let's go assume they happen. What does that look like? And how will that compare to other years? Let's assume the Olympics happen. There will be only athletes allowed. And I think very, very tight amount of staff from different countries. To give you an example, so what we're dealing with here in the States, what you have to remember is that's not what the rest of the world's dealing with. If you live in New Zealand, COVID doesn't exist and you've forgotten about it. But if you live in Japan, where less than 1% of the population is vaccinated, COVID is still very, very front of mind. It was in the news last week. I work for a cycling team who had a positive COVID case in the country of Turkey. None of those riders have received vaccinations yet. They're going about their business in a very different way, given that it's hard to receive a vaccine in a European country, but they're still going around and bike racing. It's just challenging. And I think if the Olympics happen in Japan, it's going to obviously be no fans. It's going to be I don't even think coaches are going to get credentialed, and it's going to be federation staff on a much, much different scale. So I still just go back to, I don't see a world where Japan lets 10,000 athletes from around the world into their country.
Yeah.
I'm devastated to say that, but that's you asked me, and I think that's where we end up.
It's sad. I mean, I went to the Olympics in Sochi, and the experience there was like, this is like a fantasy land. There are so many people here. It's so fun. There are events all the time.
Yep.
You can see any sport, and it's sad that we're talking about that potentially not happening this year. And
I agree.
Again, athlete safety should be the ultimate number one, but with these contracts on the line, and with, like, you look at last year, well, let's talk about that. The races that were set up to satisfy contracts, right? Like, I think what a lot of people don't know is that many of these races happened so that athletes could check the box of, I had enough appearances, or I hit the standard, or whatnot. So can you elaborate on that component a little bit?
Sure. I think I'm not a fan of doing it for that. Like, you think what you've always got to recognize is you've got to keep the number one goal in mind. And if people were having to do races to satisfy contracts, I think it's one thing to do races to satisfy performance needs, but performance ultimately has to reign. supreme, and your number one goal has to be, whatever your personal goal was. And to do like rinky dink races, I'm not a fan of. I don't support. So I had athletes that didn't get to do races last year, and they just said, look, I'm going to do content and I'm going to keep focused, and I'm not going to do an Everest attempt, or I'm not going to do a 50-mile trail run. I'm training for this race, and it's going to now happen in 2021. So
Yeah, I think that
I think what you saw last year was you saw some athletes get distracted and chase other things. And I think you've seen them pay for it in the start of 21. And I've seen that in all sports. The athletes that got distracted and wanted to do other things, they're paying for it right now.
meaning like Everesting and projects and things like that.
Yes.
You think there's a payoff there that was worth it potentially?
I'm sure that they made some sort of monetary reward for it, but monetary rewards and winning races don't always go hand in hand.
Right.
They do, but there's distractions that will reward you financially that will take away from performance down the road.
Where's the balance between in a year of no racing switching over to purely doing things for fun versus pedal to the metal and continuing to train?
Sure. So one thing that I always look out for when I onboard athletes, there's one thing that there needs to be in place for me to really dive in and say, okay, this is who I want to invest in. They need to have a coach that I believe in, right? And in this year of no racing, the coach athlete relationship was more imperative than ever, because I've seen athletes that got curious, that weren't reined in or reminded by a coach and said, no, hey, look, do not get distracted because we've got this goal. It just got moved out a year. And so I saw a year where the coaches needed to play a more imperative role than ever to avoid distraction. I forget your question, but that's my answer.
That answer or gets to the answer. The question was where's the balance between like doing things purely for fun versus
Sure.
maintaining the training.
Sure. So I always just defer to the coaches and say, look, remind ourselves, what are we here to do? What are our biggest goals? Okay, if you want to have some fun and do some exploration in the middle of this, okay, but let's not stray too far away from our core goal.
Your comment on the coach athlete relationship being more important than ever, I think, is very on the nose. I mean, I found that to be true with my own coach, that I talked to him more frequently in 2020, despite not racing a single step,
Yep.
than ever before.
Yep.
And I would assume that that was true for many athletes.
That's right.
And again, I'm not doing this professionally. I just like my goal is to stay healthy and not get injured and enjoy getting faster. And so it's sort of it's similar but different. Like I don't care if I do care. Nobody cares if I hit my performance goals in the
Yep.
same way that, a sponsored athlete has those expectations. But it was still like I can't do these wild things that, won't work for my training or health or whatever. But there was still some balance that needed to happen of like, okay, I can't race. I don't have a chance to, celebrate all this fitness. So I need to just figure it out. And so what my coach transitioned to or did was turning workouts into like big efforts. So like my 30th birthday, he gave me 30 by 1 minute on, 1 minute off. And like that was like
Yep.
the fun and the celebration. And like I did like 14 miles on a track
Yep.
and then recovered as if that had been a race. But that was like fundamentally contributing to fitness,
Yep.
which was great.
Yeah. No, I mean I was going for certain Strava segments, and I was training properly to do those, and like that was scratching my competitive itch. So I think you just have to have in the case of these athletes, they're competitive people by nature. You have to have a goal, but you also have to keep them within the rails of what are you going to do to perform now in 21.
So, what is your relationship with the coaches?
I pride myself on having a great relationship with the coaches whenever they need me. So there's sometimes I talk to them very frequently. There's sometimes we go months without speaking, but um, I work I work for my athletes, and very second to that, I work for those coaches. So there's times when I would say, a deal or something would be brought to me that I could borderline see distracting, and I would sometimes bring it to the coach first and say, hey, look, such and such athlete has this opportunity. Here's where I'm a little bit worried. What do you think? And I really want them to be a part of the process along with the athlete.
Can you give an example of that without, naming names or brands or whatnot?
Um, yeah, I mean, sure. I can just think of a time with my wife when she was, got offered to run a marathon, right? And she just said to her coach at the time, Jamie, she goes, I want to do a marathon. And he goes, look, if you want to do this as we'll call it a LSD period, a look, search, discover, great. He goes, we'll do some training. And she was also getting ready for a massive triathlon at that time, right? So anything that she was really doing more than 6K of work was of detriment potentially to a triathlon. But she had a personal itch that she wanted to scratch to go try this marathon. So that's an example of I would say a coach saying, okay, this would be outside of the guardrails, but I see you, the person, really wants to scratch this itch. Let's go check it out.
Is that a common thing to have come up, or are the athletes generally filtering based on like what they know they should be
I
doing?
mean, I get calls all the time. Like right now, this Unbound gravel race is really popular. Every brand in cycling wants their athletes at it. The reality is, it's a 200-mile gravel race that you have to be trained for, and you have to have equipment that is like second to none just to finish the race. So, an athlete, we'll use an athlete like Ellen, for example. She does a 50-minute cyclocross race. A brand wants to pay her tons of money to go do Unbound, and it's going to take her 11 hours. There is a cost to do an 11-hour race and to spend 3 or 4 months training for an 11-hour race, when in 2.5 months after, you have to be sharp for 50-minute cyclocross efforts. So I shield her from, I just say, look, this is a distraction and this is just noise. Like, do you, Ellen, want to actually do this race? If you do, great. There's brands that want to support you to do it. If not, let's explain why that race is bad for you.
That makes sense. Um,
That happens. That kind of stuff happens all the time.
that makes sense. What's your favorite part of how marketing has evolved over the last, call it, 5 years?
Right now, more than ever, the outdoor industry is in a massive boom. Right? If you go to REI, it's like, I mean, you can't even believe how busy it is. Right? Um, Bike shops. Been in bike shops for almost 20 years. Never seen bike shops with empty shelves where there's no bikes. Um,
I got a buddy who runs a shop in Boston. He's like, I'm buying tires from Target
you
to put
don't.
on the
I
bikes
mean,
to get them off the shelf.
it's unbelievable. And where bike shops were in January of 2020 versus where they are in January of 21 could not be more opposite. There's more marketing dollars available for athletes. The only other time in the cycling world that it was probably bigger was in the 90s. But right now, there's more dollars available for athletes than ever before. The athletes that are winning and are or telling stories or doing both are benefiting from that at a rate that is noticeable. So I'm thrilled with what's going on in the industry right now. I'm thrilled for where it's headed, and I'm excited to be a part of it.
I love that. I think that again, we have to look at the silver linings of COVID. From where I sit, on the brand side, we are seeing people who never would have considered taking their health into their own hands
Yeah.
and doing it in a way that they understand that, like, I need to care about this because nobody else does. You look at the outdoor industry, like people who haven't exercised in 30 years are getting a bike for the first time
Yeah.
since they were a kid, or they're getting a pair of running shoes for the first time in their life. And I think that these things will stick, and people will, satisfy the itch of, like, I need to get outside and do something for me. And they'll do it for enough time to actually start liking it. And I always say, like,
Yeah.
you need to do it for 2 weeks
Yeah.
and then you'll start to
Yeah.
like it. And I think that's happening.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I think I even just think about like the ownership of my own health that I've taken this year, where it's like I stopped drinking 7 months ago, and that was supposed to be a 1 month endeavor, but I made a sober October turned into sober COVID and beyond, and I think that there's a bunch of those experiences that other people have had, and just the growth of the outdoor industry and the boom is um, it's pretty mind blowing. It'll be interesting to, there will be we'll see what happens in a year or two from now. But right now, I mean, the numbers are just insane.
So how do you capitalize on that for your athletes?
It's my job. My secret sauce is that I know how to capitalize better than most, and I know where to go and how to do it. So my athletes that have done a great job storytelling and producing results are benefiting greatly from that.
Cool. What do you think of the trend of pro athletes with podcasts or newsletters or additional mediums outside of Instagram and Twitter?
Yeah, it's fantastic. The number one job of an athlete is ROI, right? That could be measured. We could measure that in a bunch of different ways. What athletes are given now more than ever is a bunch of different tools to demonstrate ROI. So again, when I was on the cycling team, there was one way we had ROI. It was logo on a jersey. That's it, right? Now it's a bunch of different things. It's like if you're the best podcaster, we can place value on that. If you're winning a race but not doing anything else, we can demonstrate value on that. If you have a great YouTube channel and nothing else, we can assign value to that. If you do a bunch of things, great, we can put value on that. So there's just so many different ways now to track ROI that brands can go around and say, okay, we need an athlete that's a podcaster. We need an athlete that's a YouTube person. We need one that wins races. Okay, amazing. So the end of the day, the athlete's job is to work for the brand and create ROI. ROI can look like many different things in 2021.
So for a pro athlete that might be listening to this who maybe doesn't have an agent or they represent themselves, what are your top tips for demonstrating that ROI or pitching to a brand saying, "Hey, I want to show you off"?
Sure. I would say start with one thing and become really good at it. I give the example all the time. It's like if you're super into testing wetsuits, just become the wetsuit tester and say, to brands, look, I've tested all these wetsuits. Yours is the fastest. Here's how I can continue to speak to it. If you want to be the person on the cycling world that studies chain lube and you just geek out about that, do your thing. So if I would say find the thing that you're passionate about and then just really go as deep as you can with it. And then you'll have examples of how you could say, look, this is how I provided value. These are 7 people that came back to me in my DMs and said, I went and bought such and such product because you convinced me.
I love that. I think that's great advice for pros and anyone who wants to use social media in that way. A question I like to ask athletes is around defining success, and I found some consistencies and commonalities in this answer. So I'm curious, how do you define success?
I think it goes back to what I said earlier. I wake up every morning and I love my job and I love this puzzle. And there was many years where Gwen and I struggled to figure out what we would do after her career. And that was change. That was many different things. That was forever. I mean, in 20 at the end of 2015, Gwen and I were looking at bike shops to purchase because I thought I was going to own a bike shop the rest of my life. But I wasn't like thrilled about that. That was just all I thought I knew what to do. And then it turned into I was going to buy a Great Clips franchise. And that it was like all these different things, but nothing really stuck. And that I woke up and I was fired up to challenge myself and get better every day. I'm really blessed that, Ellen called me 2.5, 3 years ago and said, I want you to do this because what it created for me was a job that I'm super passionate about and super excited to do every single day. And ultimately that's my biggest success story. That's what success looks like to me.
So your answer is in line with everyone else's, which is not a surprise. The consistency is everyone who is in a place of success defines success subjectively. Like it's not I won this or I got this contract or I got that. It's I'm happy or I'm satisfied with getting better or I'm in the process of getting better.
Yeah.
I asked one of Gwen's teammates a while ago, and this sort of triggered the whole like curiosity. Like, is this something like I was like, fast forward 5 to 10 years, what are you really proud of? And she didn't say making the Olympics. She didn't say winning. She said getting better and finding out how good I can be.
Yep.
And I was like, that's interesting. I wonder if, other people at this level are going to have similar answers. And I'd say 90% of the time, that's the answer. It's like, if your goal is a goalpost that's tangible, what happens when you achieve it? Like, what's
Yeah.
next? And I think it's useful for a while, but once you keep hitting that goalpost and getting it, then what?
Yep.
And then another topic I like to ask about is if you were to talk to an earlier version of yourself. So let's say the 2018 version of Patrick, as you're just getting into this representation career, what would you tell yourself?
I'm at a point where I don't like to look back and have regrets, and I don't really have any at this point with respect to the little business I've started. Um, yeah, it's tough to look back and think that I don't want to do anything different to get where I'm at, and I would say I want to project forward and just say, keep working hard and having fun, and keep really looking for great athletes and great stories.
Cool. I think that's a good place to wrap. If we want to find you and follow along with your journey as an agent, as a dad, as a husband to Gwen,
Sure.
where can we find you?
Probably the easiest way to check all that is on IG. I pop up on Gwen's YouTube every now and then, but I don't know. I try to post one little video of something on Instagram a week.
Awesome.
Whether it's me riding a bike, it might be Stan riding a bike, but yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I think about 90% of it is somebody on a bike.
It's somebody on a bike. Yeah, exactly. No, it was like that was I don't have any athletes that aren't there's a bicycle part of it. So like that's kind of my next big frontier. It's like, when are you going to represent an athlete that isn't bike related?
Got it. Awesome. Well, appreciate you sharing your experience and expertise on here, and hope to see you out either at a bike race or a race of some sort sometime
For
later
sure.
this year.
No, you absolutely will.
Awesome. We'll talk soon, and appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's it for today's episode. Like many long runs, it's sad when it has to end. I hope you join in next time on For the Long Run, and in the meantime, happy trails. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean a lot to me if you shared it so that others can find it and enjoy it too.